One of the temptations of the preacher is to make all conversations about grace too nice. But a true preacher of grace, like Carlos, knows that this does not help people grow in faith at all. In this book, Carlos continues his ambitious multi volume quest to make it possible to live the Christian faith authentically without either dumbing down our intelligence or forcing us into a Stockholm syndrome of speaking well, while tamping down the realities through which we are really living. Hence, Carlos has put his nets deep into the life experiences of different groups of those who have lost, of those for whom the outreach of death is a constant reality and who have had to learn a new language in order to speak at all. All this in service of grieving us a sense of how much a shake-up truly theological faith in the resurrection is when it is discovered on the inside by those who have found themselves caught up in an anarchic uprising of hope. I learned much from this book. There's words by James Allison, a priest and theologian, written in the feast of Saint Dominic of the present year, 2024, are about the book we are going to publish. Going to introduce today. We're going to launch Carlos's book. Hello, I am Juan Manuel Escamilla from Alios Ventos Ediciones, and I am honored to welcome you all to the book launch of Carlos Mendoza Álvarez's latest book, The Resurrection as a Messianic Anticipation, Grieving, Memory, and Hope from the Survivor's Perspective. This title, recently published by Alios Ventos Ediciones Library of Philosophy and Theology, is the first part of a trilogy regarding the concept of tradition. Discuss Carlos's contribution to resurrection theology and spirituality in times of unending war from the victim's perspective. I am humbled by the presence of Susan Abraham, Nancy Pineda Madrid, Andrew Priva, and the author. Firstly, I will introduce our participants and give each a few minutes to share with us their remarks concerning Carlos' book. This will leave the ensuing conversation between the author, them, and the audience. So first, I'm gonna welcome you all. Hi there, welcome to you all.
Hi.
And firstly, I'm going to introduce Nancy Pineda Madrid, who is the first theologian to publish a book on the evil of feminicide, arguing that this tragedy demands a fresh interpretation of what salvation means in her Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juarez, a reflection she has deepened in her recent Theologizing in an Insurgent Key, Violence, Women, Salvation. Presently, she is the T. Marie Chilton Professor of Catholic Theology at Loyola Marymount University, and previously she was Associate Professor of Theology and Latine Ministry at Boston College. She holds a PhD in Systematic and Philosophical Theology from the Graduate Theological Union and an Master in Divinity degree from the Seattle University in Washington. She has published numerous articles addressing questions of salvation, suffering, religious symbols, popular Catholicism, and Latina feminist theology. Welcome, Nancy, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Juan Manuel. And I just want to thank so much Carlos for the opportunity to do this. I've known Carlos for more than a decade and have been an admirer of his work for all this time. So it's a great privilege to be here today and to share some remarks with you. I want to share a little bit about the question that he's asking in this book, and a bit more about what he actually does in it and why it's an important book. So to begin, since the beginning of time, evil has presented the most serious challenge to belief in a good and loving God. When innocent victims are savagely cut down with no end in sight, how can speech about a loving God be presented credibly? In every century of the past 2 millennia, theologians have struggled to forge a response to the challenge of evil, only to find their efforts invariably fail to satisfy. Today, in the wake of the hegemonic neoliberal capitalism, the reign of traumatic death continues to spread like a parasitic scourge, consuming all in its path that would generate life. While crucifixions of the innocent abound, dare we believe in the resurrection? And that really is the central question that drives this whole book. While crucifixions of the innocent abound, dare we believe in the resurrection? A noted theologian thoroughly skilled in the arts of the poetic and the prophetic, and you see both of those run through this book richly, the poetic and the prophetic. Carlos Mendoza brilliantly examines and reimagines the theology of the resurrection. This endeavor is all the more urgent amidst the impending global collapse brought on by the ruthless force of unrestrained neoliberal capitalism with its ever-expanding reign of death-dealing power, or indeed, as he calls to our attention, necropower. Right? Necropower subjugates life and insists upon life lived under the constant threat of brutal violence aimed to kill. Mendoza Álvarez asks, where might a love be found that stands in the face of death's reign? He shifts our attention from the silence of God to the resilience of survivors. Whether we are mindful of it or not, we live in the midst of a war system, and so in a time of mourning, one in which we must recognize the rights of the dead to be seen and heard. We must recognize this if we are to credibly affirm the promise of the resurrection. He gives us a political theology, one distinct yet resonant with Johann Baptist Metz's dangerous memories, and one with attention to the interior life. Now, I think that's very important because the linking of a political theology with the interior life is something that he does very well and very richly, which is a locus of an authentic spirituality. This linking is a locus of an authentic spirituality of resistance, and it's where resistance can be born. Long recognized as an astute interpreter of René Girard, Mendoza Álvarez takes as a given that we live in an increasingly unstable world, which demands an escalating number of innocent sacrificial victims whose lives are taken to generate terror and achieve social control. This is made more traumatic by the impunity enjoyed by the perpetrators of evil. Indeed, how dare we speak of resurrection in a world governed by the logic of necropower and its violent destruction of the social body, not just individual bodies, but who we are collectively. He's really facing into a kind of sociocide, the destruction of society and all of our common bonds. His is a political theology, one thoroughly concerned with how theological discourse relates to the collapse of nation states and the organization of the human populace in space and time. It is a discourse of disappeared persons and the enduring social trauma that results, not only in Mexico, but in nation states around the globe. And as I was thinking about this, how often I think this is also evident increasingly here in the United States. We have a sense of this, of a social trauma that keeps escalating. And certainly in this moment of our election that is coming, we see the rhetoric around that very much in our discourse today. Confronted with the violent destruction of the social body, the resurrection as messianic anticipation critically interrogates the global system of neoliberal capitalism so as to help its readers see more clearly the devolution of nation states into their pre-political condition, governed by a perverse necropower that renders certain lives disposable and carrying greater economic value dead than alive. Indeed, the global free market functions as and is served as a god, destroying human lives and taking no prisoners in its wake. This God demands the emergence of new governments created to serve the interest of transnational corporations rather than the people. Global hegemonic power can only be explained at the intersection of capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism, to which must be added a fourth element, argues Mendoza Álvarez, and that is the way in which religion as a sacrificial system that justifies neo-colonial domination under new symbolic narratives of subordination, abnegation, and death. This book offers an original, gripping, intelligent, and disturbing, very disturbing, account of the necessary path of political theology. Global hegemonic power has not proceeded unchecked. It has not proceeded unchecked. Survivors have met its brutal violence with acts of resistance. That is, the refusal to live in a world given over to the desecration of what it means to be human. Survivors' acts of resistance are an insurrection, an interruption, and that's where the focus is for his discussion of resurrection. His work on insurrection is grounded in the critical thinking of philosophers from the original peoples of America, who time and again have created social movements that make possible resistance against the death powers that govern this world. This book argues persuasively for an expansion in our understanding of resurrection, one that takes seriously the bodies of those crucified by global power. Resurrection must include a praxis of memory, narration, and celebration of the victims of global power, ensuring that they will not be forgotten. These victims are still alive. They are still alive in the memories of those who have survived and in the survivors' reconstruction of the community, one born of the practice of dignity, resilience, and hope. Even after survivors have all passed on, the victims are still alive through the memory of God. Now, why is this book important and what has it accomplished? I think he has masterfully reimagined what it means to believe in the resurrection and extends our thinking about this on many fronts. Resurrection is an insurrection of life practiced with dignity, resilience, and hope for the people and communities of survivors today. The survivors teach us what resurrection means. This kind of insurrection requires new intersubjective relationships, intersubjectivities that come into being only when they shed the trappings of capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and sacrificial religious symbols, employed in the service of domination, all employed in the service of domination. Accordingly, the option for the poor finds meaning only in the affirmation of the subjectivity of the poor. That's a really key point he makes, that we really need to be focused on the subjectivity of the poor. Decolonial thinking foregrounds subjectivities in just this manner. It underscores the subjectivities that have been long negated in the social trauma of disappearances, massacres, and clandestine graves. Today, we find ourselves in the midst of a global war almost always masked from view by perverse distortions of reality. We, in this country, there are pockets and cracks where we feel, in the United States, I'm talking about the United States, pockets and cracks where we feel this very acutely. But there is an overarching kind of sense in the United States that it's a problem mostly outside of our world, not entirely, but mostly. And I think he really helps us to focus on the fact, no, it is a global phenomenon, and that's certainly true in the United States as well. The most intelligent and credible theological response can be found, meaning that the response to these perversions of reality brought on by violence. The most intelligent and credible theological response can only be found in and through a recognition and practice that affirms the subjectivities of the poor. This entails an intercultural theology of liberation, and that's what this book offers us. This book is nothing short of a tour de force. It is built on a lifetime of study and thought, showing Mendoza Álvarez at the height of his intellectual power. Not only does he signal the road ahead for political and liberation theologies, but also offers his readers a reason to place hope in the resurrection, even amidst the horror of a global collapse. With a mounting body count. Indeed, amid the rubble of global violence, resurrection must be understood as insurrection. And I also want to highlight here, I spoke a little more about political theology, but I really think what he's doing here is giving us a road ahead in terms of liberation theology, not in terms of simply continuing on the trajectory that it has historically was placed on, but really a reorienting of liberation theology from the fundamentals, because we're now talking on a global scale. And in many ways, there's a porousness to the borders around this, right? Money travels globally and it has an impact all around. And so he's really calling our attention to that. And I think calling out for a rethinking of what we need in terms of a liberation theology in our own time, which has to be a decolonial liberation theology. And I would just point out, I've done a lot of work on as was mentioned already, on violence against women. And here in the United States, I've been doing work on violence against women in terms of feminicide, the killing of women because they're women, so a gender-based violence. But looking at it here in the United States in terms of Native American women, who are very much targets, and that is not covered in the press. So there's a lot of cracks in the United States that I don't think are really widely seen and understood in the U.S. And we see all kinds of these cracks beginning to emerge in many different ways. So I want to conclude my remarks by stating that I want to raise a couple of questions about that coming out of the book. So in chapter 2, this book argues that Catholicism has been reshaped to advance a colonial internalized knowing. This book talks about different epistemological ecologies, including the knowing that comes from the Southern Hemisphere, knowing from popular movements. And these present today a challenge to universities. And that challenge to universities is that we need a new model of knowing, one that and a new model of what it means to be a university, one characterized by a decolonial perspective. And that means to advance knowing justly. What would it mean to know justly? And I raise that because he talks a lot about abysmal knowing, which is knowing at the intersection of capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism. And as I thought about this point about knowing that he puts on the table, it took me back immediately to the whole discussion of the doctrine of discovery that was began certainly in the 15th century, and there's been a lot more discussion of it recently because of, well, for many reasons, but certainly in the theological world, with Pope Francis's discussion in Canada, that has come to the fore. Again, the discussion of the doctrine of discovery. And certainly there's been much more of a critical conversation around that. And as you recall, the doctrine of discovery was advanced through a number of papal bulls at the late part of the 15th century, through 3 papal bulls, pronouncements. And originally it was designed to protect one European country from another in terms of their claiming of land as they came to what is today the America, the whole of America, North and South. And what happened is that these bulls ignored the fact that there were indigenous populations here. And so eventually, though, the bulls were reoriented, and this is where the doctrine of discovery becomes quite it's heinous all along, but even more acutely as it develops, because it quickly transitions into a claim that because Christians from Europe were bringing Christianity to the New World and were bringing salvation here to these lands that were not previously occupied by a Christian ruler, they could be claimed by Spain, because the thinking was that salvation and Christianity would because of the value of that basically anything that whatever suffering or pain or tragedy occurred, that if at the end of the day it brings salvation and Christianity, that it's worth it. Okay, that's where the doctrine of discovery eventually got moved. And as you can see here, of course, there is a grotesque distortion of the meaning of Christianity and salvation in what I've just explained, with utterly evil consequences. So part of what I'm wrestling with is, how do we come to know theology justly in the face of this long trajectory, this connection with the doctrine of discovery? So that's one of my questions today. How do we know theology justly in the face of this? And I'm sure a decolonial perspective and orientation is absolutely integral to it. And I have another question that I want to raise, and this comes from chapter 5. This book speaks of resurrection as messianic and systematic. And it argues that by doing so, then we will be able to develop the core of our theological argument to think of the resurrection as prolepsis, as messianic anticipation in times of horror, through an anti-systemic messianic practice. Okay, so this whole notion of a very deep reading, a new reading of prolepsis. Prolepsis, well, you see it throughout the theological discourse. Certainly one of the key figures that put prolepsis on the table a long time ago, but certainly not the first, was Wolfhard Pannenberg. But Mendoza Álvarez is giving us a very different reading of prolepsis. And I'm seeing what he's talking about here, the anti-systemic messianic praxis. That in many ways that there's a link between that and what he calls for in chapter 4, which is, he states that to be Christian is to have a binomial hermeneutical orientation. We have to have a kind of vision on 2 levels, right? And I was hoping that we could examine more carefully what an anti-systemic messianic praxis means in terms of the necessity of a binomial hermeneutical orientation. I think these 2 come together and they're important together. And I just like to learn more about what that looks like and what it calls us to. So those are a couple of questions that I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to dive into. Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here and to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I'm gonna introduce now Andrew Privot. He traces his roots to the mixture of French and African peoples in pre-war slaveholding Louisiana, rooted in Roman Catholic and Black African American spiritual traditions. He studies Christian spirituality and its vital role in contemporary theology, philosophy, culture, and politics. Diverse experiences of prayer, worship, and contemplation guide his approach to topics in systematic theology, such as the Trinity and Christology. These spiritual phenomena likewise inform his research on postmodern critiques of metaphysics and associated theories of relational subjectivity. This grounds his engagement with social movements for healing and liberation. He explores how practices of intimacy with God empower communities to resist interlocking forms of economic, racial, sexual, colonial, and environmental violence. Currently, he is the Joseph and Winifred Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies, a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and professor of theology and religious studies. He's a former member of Boston College's Department of Theology and affiliate faculty member in Boston College's African and African Diaspora Studies program. He holds a PhD in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. He's the author of two constructive theological monographs, The Mysticism of Ordinary Life, Theology, Philosophy, and Feminism, and Thinking Prayer, Theology and Spirituality Amid the Crisis of Modernity, along with a shorter introduction book, Theology and Race, Black and Womanist Traditions in the United States. Besides, he's co-editor with Vincent Lloyd of Anti-Blackness and Christian Ethics, and the author of more than 30 articles and book chapters. And he's now working on a new book that examines oppressive power dynamics and life-giving possibilities in Christian asceticism, as well as a collection of essays on Christian spirituality and Black life. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Juan Manuel, and thanks also to Nancy for those beautiful remarks. And my gratitude especially goes to Carlos, who's written a wonderful book. And I have to say that, in my opinion, Carlos is one of the most important living theologians whom we should all be reading and studying very closely. Yes, in part because of the things that he writes, the things that he says and teaches in his classrooms to his students and to us at conferences and things like that. But above all, because of the way he listens, because of who he's listening to, how deeply rooted his thought is in the voices of others who are often not heard in these academic spaces in which we work. And so for these reasons, I am very moved and inspired by his method as a theologian. And I think that this is a great event for us to launch this new book, this new translation into English. And so hopefully his readership will just continue to expand. In my brief time today, I want to make three observations and then raise one question. So my first observation will be about fundamental theology, second about spirituality, and the third about uprising. And then my question will be about the meaning of this term survivor and how far that extends. So first, Carlos, the first time I met him, let me know that he was a fundamental theologian. And I want to acknowledge and appreciate that fact about the way he approaches his intellectual task. So what does that mean to be a fundamental theologian? Well, there was a time when what that meant was to examine the supposedly universal and necessary conditions of reason and of being itself that would allow for a revelation of God to occur, that would allow for some understanding of it to take place. And so essentially it was a kind of offshoot of metaphysics, a kind of translation project between the metaphysical discourses of the West, the Western tradition, and Christian thought, trying to show how the one provides foundational concepts that make possible the other. Now, fundamental theology took a dramatic turn with the work of Johann Baptist Metz, whom Nancy has already mentioned, and his development of a practical fundamental theology centered on the categories of memory, narrative, and solidarity, and that was grounding Christian faith in the concrete historical and social realities of people's lives. Metz's transformation of fundamental theology was indebted to the Frankfurt School, to critical theory, to negative dialectics, and in a particular way foregrounded the memory of the Second World War and the 6 million plus Jewish victims of the Shoah, and of the Christian complicity, the European Christian complicity in that trauma and that violence and that massive death. So for Metz, fundamental theology became a questioning theology that was asking questions not only about the justice of God, but the justice of humanity in the face of such horror, of such contradiction. Now, in many ways, Carlos's work is indebted to that spirit, but goes far beyond it in postmodern and decolonial directions that are revitalizing of this project of a practical fundamental theology. So in addition to, folks in the Frankfurt School who would still be in the background, there are newer postmodern thinkers such as Derrida and Zizek and Agamben and so on, who helped to shape Carlos's perspective. But he also is talking about Mbembe and Fournet Bedancourt and Mamani and Leva and many other theorists from the global South, from indigenous communities who are working with different epistemologies, different cultural contexts, different lines of interrogation. And so for Carlos, fundamental theology is still asking questions about revelation, about tradition, but centering the voices of survivors in the process of doing that, centering the questions that must be asked about kind of hegemonic knowledge, instrumental reason, and so on, but from the perspective of the subaltern underside. So that's a very new way of doing fundamental theology, and one that I'm very enthusiastic about. My second point has to do with spirituality. I've spent a lot of time in my work thinking about what that word spirituality means, how it's been developed by different traditions and communities, and what relevance it might have for our world today. I think Carlos's work is a great source for reflection on those same topics. He talks about a process of spiritual accompaniment, a process of finding the presence of God, the God who passes through history, not just in individual acts of prayer or solitude, but in communal efforts to reckon with the truth of horror, the truth of traumatizing events in history, and to remember them, to narrate them, to resist them, but also to celebrate those who are most affected by them, whether those who are suffering or those who are dead because they've been disappeared or tortured or killed or whatever has happened. So this is all praxis, but it's a spiritual praxis. It's biopsychosocial and spiritual all at the same time. It's a holistic engagement with how these forces of violence, this necropower, shapes our human lives, but also how the presence of the living God, the God of life, can still be found in that intersubjective, messianic, apocalyptic community that is waiting for a divine victory over these forces of death. So to locate spirituality in those intersubjective places, in those solidarities, in those acts of accompaniment where you're not just thinking about other people or reading their work, but you're actually present with them in their struggles. To locate spirituality in those places, to me, seems like the way to go. It's the way to find the God who will always side with the persons who are mistreated, abused, despised, cast out. So what would it mean to think about spirituality in those ways? I think that's a question that his book sheds a great deal of light on. My final point has to do with this brilliant word that shows up a number of times in the book, uprising. And the way I read it is that this is a translation of the word resurrection. That uprising and resurrection are synonymous, even though we don't often think of them as such. We think of uprisings as these kind of political events, and resurrection as a doctrine about a miraculous thing that happened to Jesus and that maybe will happen to the rest of us eschatologically. But what I think Carlos does is remind us that these are essentially the same. These are the interruptive, miraculous happenings where life says no to death, where death does not have the final word, where God appears in the midst of a community that will not be defeated, no matter the odds that they are up against, no matter how many generations of trauma have been endured. And so to think about rising up against the powers of evil as a form of participation in the crucified salvific event of resurrection is, I think, one of the fundamental theological insights of this project. It's something that allows us to discover theologically relevant content in social movements that might not be explicitly religious, and to form solidarities across various different communities. Finally, my question about this book has to do with the word survivors. And I noticed that that word tends to be favored by Carlos over the word victims. You know, the liberation theologian John Sobrino thinks about the importance of doing Christology from the viewpoint of the victims. Carlos is saying we need to redefine tradition as a culture of survivors. But my question is whether that word survivors includes even the dead. Whether that's the radical claim that's being made here about the meaning of the resurrection. That in some sense, even the dead are not lost and gone from a divine perspective. That they too survive in our memory, in our narrative, in our celebrations, in our resistance, and ultimately somewhere deep in the mystery of God's own heart and plans and designs and messianic promises. And so my question is there a meaningful distinction to be made still between victims and survivors? Or, Carlos, are you suggesting that survivors is the better category for all of us? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. And yeah. Now let's introduce Susan Abraham, who explores. Just give me a second. Let me get her in the screen. There it is. Susan Abraham explores post-colonial religious practices in her teaching and research. Her publications and presentations with practical theological insights from the experience of working as a youth minister for the Diocese of Mumbai, India, with theoretical perspectives from post-colonial theory, cultural studies, and feminist theory. Ongoing research projects include issues in decolonizing theological education and formation, interfaith and beliefs, religion and nationalism, global Catholicism, and Christianity between colonialism and post-colonialism. In addition to being president of the prestigious Concilium Theology Journal, she is currently a professor of theology and postcolonial cultures, vice president of academic affairs, and dean of faculty at the Pacific School of Religion. She is the author of Identity, Ethics, and Nonviolence in Postcolonial Theory, a Ranerian theological assessment, and co-editor of Shoulder to Shoulder, Frontiers in Catholic Feminist Theology. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Juan Manuel, and thank you, Carlos, for your invitation. And I do want to so much thank my fellow panelists, both Andrew and Nancy, for their remarkable insights. I asked to go last because while I have a lot of thoughts about the book, I was wondering whether I should actually also think about the work and place it in the kind of administrative work that I do. And the reason for me doing that is in my job as the Vice President for Academic Affairs in an institution that provides theological education and theological instruction, it is sometimes difficult to manage what may be an individual scholar's deepest yearning to do their original work and what, as an administrator, I might see as being a little bit more important in terms of a public need. In fact, one of the things that I do also is to think with in the US, a national organization called the Association of Theological Schools, and ask questions about how do people's research really address the needs of the church or address the needs of the general public. An astonishing figure, according to certain research done by ATS, is that more than 86% of respondents, when asked, who are scholars in the field of theology or religion, when asked, how do you come to a research idea, 86% said it was related to their specific intellectual and personal interests, that they weren't really considering the needs of the church or the needs of the world or the society at large. And from an administrative perspective, that is always a problem because many of us are in a culture of survival, especially when it comes to the study of religion and theology. Even these languages have been put to use in certain ways where there is a lot of energy, and some of it is very bad energy. But religion and theology have been put to use in forms of colonial subjugation and dominance that the objective, scientific, however you want to call these, and I know all these words are highly problematic, but the study of these in the way that we imagined as scholarly work is rapidly declining. At the same time, the desperate need of the world and of the church is precisely also how to survive in this onslaught of other cultural logics that have taken over in the academy, in the university, in academic institutions. So my interest really was floating around those ideas. How would my faculty, how would I teach this book in an academic institution? Well, the good news is that this book would be very, very welcome, precisely for all the reasons that both Nancy Pineda Madrid and Andrew Prevost have raised. The book asks deep questions about the nature of theology. The book asks who a theologian is. I was first amused in a very positive way, and then so inspired, because one of the things that Carlos does, and I've known Carlos as a friend for a long time, hence I address him as Carlos, is that he is an author. I don't know how else to say it. The expectations of an author always is that they would produce this brilliant knowledge that they ascribe solely to themselves. If you look at the book and the people, the sheer breadth of thinkers and authors that he raises, and also practitioners who was a couple of them with master's theses or master's work, who would never find their way into a scholarly journal. I could bring this book to my community here in my institution and say, here, look at how this thinker is using a master's level analysis and showing how positively that master's level analysis is contributing to the study of religion. My students and my faculty would be very inspired by that. So ever since I've known Carlos, he has done this unconferencing and unauthoring. In other words, the way he does theology is to interrupt the ways in which we imagine the sole thinker, the omniscient author or the omniscient narrator, the very important theologian from whose mind and mouth spews all these ideas ex nihilo. It comes from nowhere. This is specifically not the case in the way Carlos Mendoza Álvarez writes and presents. So I've been with him in multiple forums where we see this phenomenon happening, which is on the one hand, laying a frame, and on the other, inside that frame are the most surprising sources of thought. So who is a theologian and what is theology is really a matter of discovery. You really have to walk with Carlos here to see where he sees these insights being developed. So that was one kind of thing. The other shiny object that I think I spent my whole time as I was thinking about what to say, I got totally diverted by another big thing in the book, which is a topic that is very close to my heart, and that is the topic of temporality. So for me, discourses about time are very revealing. Traditional theology has always, not exclusively, but preponderantly examined knowing and being. So epistemology and ontology have been kind of like the basis of a lot of theological rumination. Of course, precisely because of the resurrection and because of the idea of messianic time, especially in Jewish thought, and then getting developed in Christian thought in conversation with Judaism and Islam, in the medieval context, there is a sense that somehow thinking about time is also very, very important for theology. And here, I find that the resurrection really challenges us to think about temporality in certain ways. The way Carlos would say it is that, the resurrection introduces a time of the divine. I want to do a little bit of a cross-cultural and maybe a little bit of an interreligious thought over here, only because I inhabit those spaces. I'm not a scholar as such of these things, but because I grew up in India and this is very much part of my DNA, I think of it in these ways. Before a resurrection, there is always a moment of destruction. So within a Hindu worldview, and I'm speaking very broadly, so Hindu scholars out there, please forgive me. I grew up in India, so it is very much part of my ethos, not a scholarly focus. But this idea that destruction is devoid of the divine is actually abhorrent, in my view, of within a Hindu worldview. It is so abhorrent that we invent the thought that human beings cannot even do destruction properly. So a proper destruction, which is complete and utter annihilation, requires the presence of the divine. So the other day, the day of the debate, and again, apologies to international scholars over here, because those of us in the United States are completely immersed in this issue right now, as you can imagine, because the stakes are very high. Uh, Before the debate, a friend and I were talking, and I said, well, this is why the Hindus talk about this age as the Kali Yuga. So the age of Kali, when everything is ending, when everything is poised to end. But it's called Kali Yuga. It's not the age of nothingness. It is not the age of the absence of the divine. Uh, the divine is here. Of course, the Hindus are very clever in that there is this feminine energy here at this time of ending. And then there is the great god of destruction, Shiva. Now, of course, we can have all kinds of discussions about, is it a gender issue? Is Kali weaker than Shiva? All Hindus will laugh at such an idea. There is no such thing. It is simply forms of energy. But the intuition that the divine attends death, the intuition that the divine attends destruction is a critical one. So as I was reading the book, I was asking a question, which even makes me uncomfortable for other reasons. But where is God in all this? Yes, of course, Carlos, I know. I've learned more about God from you than in many other places. I'm just trying to push the idea. How does God attend our destruction? And therefore, out of that destruction, how is our capacity to survive fostered, nourished, cultivated? So it's a very subtle thing, and the reason is, again, on the subcontinent, for eons, between the forces of nature and between all the marauding armies that conquered India multiple times, across centuries and eons and millennia, deep in the psyche of surviving Indians is this idea that suffering is a given. It's the givenness of life. So time is to be understood within these limits of human finitude. It is not, it doesn't necessarily lead to despair. What it leads to is, as you say in the book, an acceptance of the givenness of human frailty. But in that very moment of acceptance of human frailty is the profound revelation that this human frailty is held within a divine, I don't want to use these hyper rational words, but in a divine view. The word that I rejected in my mind just now was plan, because that makes it hyper rational, as if God sits there and makes calculations about X, Y, and Z. That's not the ethos. The ethos is there is this view in which destruction has a certain meaning. It is not devoid of meaning, because not just because of what human beings bring to it and the human capacity to survive it, but because of the presence of God in the middle of destruction. So that subtle piece introduces a different sense of time and temporality. Suffering exists, death exists, and as within that coexistence is a divine human continuing relationship. So for me, that kind of it plays into what I would say are survivors and their sense that what is happening to me right now is not the end of the story. And the capacity to overcome it, the capacity for resilience, comes out of that knowing, that just knowing that Dr. Pineda Madrid referred to, the knowing justly that God is with me, with us in our destruction. And even if everything seems to be coming apart, it is in the view of God. I don't want to use the word plan. I don't want to use that kind of idea, because it is not human rationality. This is a divine one. So time in this view is very different. It's not moments of creation and suffering and death and resurrection. Because of the presence of God in all of these moments, it is always resurrection. So, of course, this sounds like, this might sound like I'm saying, the battered woman or the person who is at the receiving end of racist attacks. And these are all experiences I'm very, very familiar with, by the way. That somehow I can justify it as part of, a divine sense of how the world is. That's not how it is. My idea is that there is a recollection, a remembrance, not just of survivors and the stories that we are telling about those who live and continue to live, but of divine accompaniment. And it's there in the book. It's saturated in all of your pages. And that is the theology that I wanted to point to. And then one final thing, only because I was looking, you have been to India, and I see the marks of India in the book. You talk about Kurushamala and other experiences in India. And you and I have been in Africa. You and I have been in Latin America and in the United States. And all of these places have created your worldview. But all of these places have their own stories too. On no place on this planet was the creation of the nation state a peaceful one. Every nation state on this planet arose, continues, and will sustain itself into the future in a crucible of violence, sometimes unbelievable violence. So for me, the remembrance should also perhaps include the memory of those Holocausts that we don't remember. Um, Alongside with the Shoah, absolutely, very pivotal moment in our Christian and Western European history, alongside the Shoah were equally other horrifying instances of nation states coming to be. One of them would be the partition of India and what happens to religion. I think, as Nancy said, what happens to religion when it becomes the purveyor of that kind of violence. So those were some of my thoughts as I was reading. I just want to thank you very much, Carlos, for a very inspiring book, and my colleagues for their wonderful comments. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Susan, for your thought-provoking words. And it's now turn for Carlos to reply all these comments and questions. I'm going to introduce him. Carlos Mendoza Álvarez is a Mexican theologian of the Dominican order. For 27 years, he has developed a fundamental theology in critical dialogue with modernity, where the phenomenology of subjectivity, mimetic theory, and decolonial thought converge in dialogue with the social movements of America, or should I say, Abiyala. Presently, he is developing a concept of tradition as a performative faith emerging from the resistance of the victims of systemic violence. Within critical thought and spirituality, he accompanies survivors of various forms of violence in dignified and hopeful resistance. Presently, he is a professor at the Department of Theology at Boston College. He holds a doctorate in fundamental theology from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, where he also obtained his habilitation. He was a member of the National System of Researchers until 2021 and has been a professor at the Pontifical University of Mexico and the Ibero-American University. He has also been invited to teach at universities in Switzerland, Brazil, Colombia, the United States, and elsewhere. He has published 8 books and participated in some 25 collected books. He has also published over 50 articles in various topics in various journals. But I will highlight a few of his publications. Firstly, of course, besides this one, mutual accompaniment in the divine ruach, on discernment and spirituality at uncertain times, a title which recently inaugurated Alios Bento's Library of Spirituality, as well as his previous trilogy, Deus Ineffabilis, Deus Absconditus, and Deus Liberans. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Juan Manuel. Thank you. And I'm so thankful to Susan, Nancy, and Andrew for your wonderful thoughts, insights, and questions, of course, to continue the conversation. For me, this is like a banquet, Eucharistic banquet, presided by Divine Sophia in some way, this roundtable, launching this book on the resurrection, the translation into English. I would like to say 4 different things and then engage a conversation with you following your questions. First of all, to talk a little bit about the trilogy. The trilogy is 2 of them that I'm working on. I've been working on that for 25 years. Well, I was raised as a fundamental theologian, as Andrew mentioned, in the Western traditional way of the academy in Mexico and then in Europe, in Freiburg, in Switzerland, following the path, of course, of Aquinas as a general framework to understand the conversation with different authors, philosophers in and outside Christianity. But because of the linguistic turn and the hermeneutical turn, I received a particular training on hermeneutics. My mentor in Freiburg, Guido Vergouwen, he was one of the disciples in the Netherlands of Edward Hillebecks. So I received this influence, of course. And at the same time, rooted in liberation theology in Mexico, I tried to make some connections between liberation theology of the first and second generation, trying to engage a conversation with the European theologians and philosophers, particularly taking into account the linguistic turn. And so that's why I was also trained in phenomenology, following Ricoeur, particularly Levinas, the first time Husserl. But that part of my training was absolutely important to understand my role as a theologian. And I've been working on that for several years. But in the last 10 years, probably, I would say, I started like a process of conversion, I would say epistemological conversion, trying to listen carefully other epistemologies, other ways of knowing about life, about human dignity, about the mystery of love, cosmos, and so on. And that was because of probably biographical experiences related to the communities of the indigenous First Nations in Chiapas. I was in contact with them since the beginning of my religious life as a Dominican, with Raúl Vera, bringing us to Chiapas together as a group of novitiates in order to discover the spiritual life of the indigenous communities in Chiapas. So, for instance, the connection with the First Nations in my country was like a source of an important turn in my theological training, and also related to other social movements like, of course, the families of the disappeared persons, but also queer people, immigrants. And so I realized then that my theology needed at that time to change not only the object of study, but the sources and also the language. And trying then to reshape the idea of revelation and then tradition, the 2 great fields of fundamental theology. And that's why, well, this book about the resurrection is like the second trilogy. The first thing of tradition, the source of tradition is the original event, right? So the original event of Christian faith is the resurrection. And that's why it was so crucial to me to start this second trilogy, thinking differently about the resurrection as an experience that is, of course, related to Jesus of Nazareth, the community of survivors, his community of survivors. as model, as a general pattern in order to understand other process of mourning, loss, of course, mourning, and then a kind of indignation because of the righteous people of the world. Also, that's why I started the second trilogy on the idea of resurrection, and I've been working for a couple of years now. On the next second book is about the idea of sacramentality. So, if the original event is the resurrection, how can we celebrate, perform, receive, and communicate this event to others? And that's why it's not about the sacraments I'm interested in, but it's about how the people of God, as a broad understanding of the people of God, any human being and community, or even in creation, how can we communicate the loving God, the loving presence of God in our lives? And the third and last book, if it's possible in my academic life, would be focusing a political theology. What kind of new networks are raising from the experience of the survivors inside and beyond the church or the religious institution? Because what I'm trying to think about is how can we connect with other cultures and religions, because that's why what I've been discovering with communities of immigrants, for instance, communities of indigenous people, queer people, women, and so on. So we need to go beyond the very like traditional identities, and we need to move forward in some way to understand human kind as a whole. And in this way, I'm following also the insights coming from political ecology, saying we need to go back to think as human species, not only as peoples or individuals or cultures. We need to go back to this communal belonging each other as human beings, and then together with Mother Earth. So that's why, well, the trilogy about the idea of tradition is started with this book about resurrection. And the methodology that I've been exploring in this book in a particular way is related to events that I've been living in the past 10 years. For instance, some conferences at the Iberoamericana University at the time when David Fernandez was the president, a great thinker, a Jesuit who was leading the university at that time. He invited us to think about the social incidents of the university and knowledge, and to open the doors, the windows to social movements in order to understand what are they looking for, how they are thinking about life, about democracy, about gender equality, but also about spirituality and theology. So we started a magnificent, a very challenging journey, engaging a conversation with social movements in Mexico, in Central America, in South America, in the United States too, trying to figure out the intersections between all those social movements and the spirituality that is supporting all of them in a very pluralistic way, of course. So this new methodology, then I was looking for some kind of theoretical frameworks to understand this diversity. And that's why decolonial thinking, queer theory, helped me in that way to understand the connections that I've seen on the ground, working with the communities of the indigenous people and the immigrants and so on. So the new methodology I've been in some way improving helped me at that time to understand differently the option for the poor in a more interpersonal way. So because the first generation liberation theologians, they were insisting about friendship with the poor, a kind of solidarity, and I think was crucial 50 years ago to take the side of the poor in order to change structural violence. But the question for me was, and what about the subjectivity of the poor themselves? And I discover accompanying communities that we need to go back to that source, which is our own subjectivity. and our own vulnerability in some way, because connecting each other in this level allows us to understand differently what life is about. And that's why, well, the new methodology was in some way, of course, trying to frame theoretically what was going on on these processes. We gather in different moments with social movements in 2019, for instance, together with Concilium, the Journal of Theology, and the Iberoamericana University, welcoming different social movements who were in the region looking for the spirituality, supporting their resistances. And that was a great event that helped me to understand differently what's the role of theology. But also some other moments, last year, for instance, at the Jesuit University in Guadalajara, the ITESO, together with a group of friends, theologians from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, we organized an important meeting and workshop and festival. We call that Reexiste, the Spirit Crossing Peripheries. And once again, it was a kind of exploration of how the Spirit, the Ruach, the divine Ruach, is accompanying us in so different ways. So this new methodology in some way is like the behind the scenes, what was is supporting this book about the resurrection. This book is mainly, well, an academic work trying to frame and to phrase differently the idea of the resurrection related to our personal journeys, facing any kind of evil. And that's why the methodology that this book represents in some way, for me, represents much more than this. It's not only the book. Is many people, many communities are like part of this process of the new understanding of what resurrection is about. And that's why my third point is about who are my partners in my theological journey. Of course, for several decades, my main partners were great authors. Of course, I was reading the sources, the patristic, the biblical sources, the medieval sources, and the modern ones. But also my colleagues in the contemporary different societies of theology. But then suddenly I realized that the sources coming from different backgrounds were also important. And that's why the social movements became another reference partners in the conversation about what theology, redemption, forgiveness is about. And that's why I moved my work trying to listen carefully, following the colonial spirit and path and mode, this kind of process of listening carefully. We as intellectuals being at the rear guard of the social movements, trying to listen carefully and then to articulate and criticize a narrative about those topics, for instance, about democracy and human rights and equality, or about gender and diversity, or about spirituality and interculturality. So this idea of opening the windows to understand the sources where theology is rising from, for me was really a discovery in the last 10 years. And I would like to say something else. Fourth point is about my hope. Where is my hope now? Because we as theologians, we are part of a community of believers, but people who are waiting for accomplishment of creation and salvation, right? So, but we are not alone. So the question is, where is my hope located, and who are my partners in this journey? And that's why I made an important decision for this book. And in alliance with Alios Bentos, I found that this was the best way to publish the book, because with editorial houses in the US, I was struggling a lot because I'm not a well-known author. And the manuscript was refused by some of them, saying, well, the book has been published already in Spanish and Portuguese, so it's not probably an important book here in the US context, and so on. And the market is very cruel in some way. So I was thinking for other options because I wanted also mainly to offer open access, free access on PDF to the people. The people I've been learning with what theology is about. Not only the academy, and I know our colleagues probably would be interested in reading this book, but my main goal in this English translation would be to attend people in Africa, in Asia, in other contexts, particularly in the global South. As you know, I prefer another expression, the epistemic South. So those communities of survivors who are looking for hope, as I am looking for hope together with other communities in my context. So my hope is to engage a conversation, a global conversation with those people, theologians, artists, but mainly practitioners, leaders of social movements who are engaged in an experience of resilience, resistance, and re-existence. Because, well, this trilogy matters in some way. Resilience is not enough. Resilience is important in order to support trauma. To go beyond, we need to resist, and then we need to reinvent ourselves. And that's why decolonial thinkers like Nelson Maldonado Torres, a good colleague and friend, he's talking about a combative decoloniality, a more creative way of re-existing together. And so my hope is there. In this context, I would like just to mention in a few minutes what you, Nancy, and of course, Andrew and Susan mentioned about this book. Thank you so much for your kind words and thoughts. Well, about the colonial internalized knowing that Nancy was mentioning as a challenge to universities. Today I'm located now in Santiago de Chile. I'm attending a conference on the crisis of theology and religious sciences facing different questions coming from instance in Chile, the sexual abuse crisis here. And the question is that I was trying to explain here, exploring also, was that we need to decolonize our subjectivities also. We need probably to understand differently that in order to create a right narrative about what resurrection is about, we need also to go deeper in our own subjectivities as partners in the conversation with other people, with the victims. And in that way, I'm connecting with Andrew's also question about the victims and the survivors. Of course, the victims still there, and the victims, the death particularly, they're still waiting for justice. Of course, Metz was right, saying that we are in charge of that memory as survivors, but it's because of the death. And Benjamin, of course, in 20th century reminded us how important it is to not forget the death. But I prefer, and the story appears in this book, is a curandero, a healer from Bojayá, the African Colombian community. In one colloquia that we organized at the Ibero some years ago, he was there talking about, as a healer, accompanying a community of experiencing a kind of trauma, social trauma, a kind of killers who were there threatening the community, and there was a massacre there. And as a healer, he said, the dead, they have rights that we are not respecting, the survivors. It's the right to become ancestors, because they live in a different dimension of life, of the universe. But through the funeral ritual, they become ancestors. They still connected to the community. And for me, that was a deeper understanding of the debt we have towards the death than Benjamin's idea. So because it's not only about memory and reparation, that's important, but it's because the spiritual connection with the death is the source of any resistance. And that's the way I would like just to connect This question coming from Nancy about, well, how can we internalize in some way the decolonial process in order to understand differently what theology is about, what our role as theologians, as scholars too in different universities, but related to the local context. Are we accompanying communities in their struggles for life? Are we thinking critically together with the communities we are accompanying, facing racism, ableism, any kind of violence, structural violence? How do we know theology and how we do theology in this context? So for me, this is the great question. And what I've learned in the last years, last decade, in some way, is the only way to do that is experiencing that kind of epistemic conversion. The epistemic conversion means in some way that I need to stop talking, thinking, and there is an apophatic and spiritual experience in this process of taking time to listen. Who? Those who are the knowers, the sabedores, sabedoras in Spanish, those who knows what they are experiencing, and listen them carefully, then we can focus better on the insights in order to understand what's going on in this situation and how can they overcome different kinds of trauma. For me, this is the only way to really experience a new methodology. It's a conversion in our minds, in our hearts, and in some way, this is an interruption of time. Talking about temporality, it's about this interruption that opened the doors to salvation is, of course, a question of timing, but it's also a question of space. And I would like just to complexify a little bit your comments, Susan. I'm trying to interconnect the three different speeches you did and then the questions raised. Probably temporality is just one side of the moon. We can see the other is not only about temporality but space. And I've learned that from the indigenous communities and feminist movements in Latin America. They invented the word, the feminist colleagues, acuerpar. It's like a social embodiment. It's like a way of strengthening the relationship between the victims, among the victims, in order to find strength and force, and also the possibility to cry together. I've seen many times with mothers of the disappeared people how their anger, their rage because their children are not with them, is of course a source of suffering. But when they listen to each other, when they organize each other, and then they create a community of searchers, madres buscadoras, then they become in some way a new being, because their interconnection absolutely matters. And in this way, the connection among the victims is absolutely important, because then they become survivors. Of course, there is a dialectical, I would say, Andrew, relationship between the victims and the survivors. But the survivors is like pointing out the responsibility that is related to us, because we're still there. Yesterday, in this colloquium, talking about sexual abuse crisis in Chile, somebody in the audience, a trans person, is a student at the Catholic University in Santiago, raised an important question. What about, we are talking about the survivors of violence and sexual abuse crisis, but what about those who are not anymore among us because they're dead? Many of them committing suicide. Some of them women, many men, but also trans persons. How can we take into account this void? So that's why I think temporality matters, but space too. Space is related to intersubjectivity in my understanding. So how the other in some way is present or absent, it is related deeply to us. And in my understanding, what I would like to explore in the following experiences and personal journey, but also in a theological manner, is how can we create rituals of survivors? How can we learn from those who are creating those sacraments of life among that? How is important to understand this sacramentality of the people of God? And if I have just a couple of minutes, may I, Juan Manuel, just to end these comments, it's about what Susan was also mentioning. I was just mentioning temporality, but the void of the space. And the role of India. I visited India many years ago. I spent a month at Kurisumala Monastery, and I was really struck by the experience of void in that way, because of the remembrance of the forgotten, and because I was sharing with them Holy Week and also on Holy Saturday, the idea of Jesus going to looking for Adam and Eve. And this is silence of God. This canonical experience in Holy Saturday is absolutely important. And there is a door, the Guha, is the door where Christ descended into hell looking for the death. And I think this is the process of resurrection. This is the same dynamic experience that I've also in some way witnessed with the families of disappeared people. When they found some human remains in a mass grave, what they are doing is transforming death into life in a very material way. They caress the bones, they talk to them, they send the bones, of course, to the researchers to look for their DNA, and then they deliver in a kind of procession after days or months those human remains to the families, and then the funeral happens. It's a way of reconfiguring the community, and then it's a way of strengthening also the community of survivors in order to look for justice, reparation if possible, and so on. So hope is in that way deeply related to an experience of resisting against different kinds of death. And well, that's why resurrection, in my understanding, matters, because it's deeply related to our experience of life, fighting for life amidst death, and particularly those who are in the everyday life facing any kind of trauma. They become masters of hope when they go deeper into their mourning process, and then they can uprise. The question of uprising, we will be continue probably talking about this later. But uprising from death because of together with others, as survivors, we take into charge violence to transform that violence in a communal experience of love. Thank you.
No, thank you, Carlos. This is absolutely lovely. I'm gonna give you an alternative for replying Carlos's latest comment. If anyone wants to jump in. Because if no one does, there is a question from the audience that I would like to read, maybe before some final remarks, and before saying goodbye, because the time is
over.
Is over. It's up. So, just a quick question from Natalia Stengel. Is this political theology presenting resistance against what Sayak Valencia calls core capitalism? And how is the notion of a slow forms of killing that Butler labels all the exploitative production, which is how Butler labels all the exploitative production forms that sacrifice the majority in favor of producing for a very few, articulated in your analysis?
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. We could continue conversation probably next book. No, but anyway, of course, the ideas of Sayak Valencia about core capitalism and how she is deeply related to other decolonial and transfeminist approaches. It's really connected to what I'm doing. I've been learning so much from Sayak Valencia, Judith Butler, but also Membe, as Andrew mentioned too. So we need to improve a theology of a resurrection as a resistance, coming from those who are facing in their everyday life death through different forms, masked as capitalism or patriarchy or ableism or racism, of course, and so on. So resurrection is an experience coming from those who are facing evil in their own bodies and territories, of course. Some final remarks. Sorry for the timing.
Yeah, time is it's up, but
It's cruel.
yeah, time is cruel.
And
Especially
this is why I say temporality is important.
it is indeed.
Absolutely.
True.
Well, I'm gonna give you an opportunity for final remarks, and then I'm afraid that's gonna be it.
Yeah. Thank you.
So maybe write in the same order as you spoke. So Nancy, you go first.
Wow. Well, this has been a very, very rich exchange. And I originally read this book in Spanish and then have now, with the translation into English. But one of the things that occurred to me, especially off of what Carlos has just said, was in Spanish, it's the insurrection. The insurrection is a central concept there. In Spanish, insurrección, right? But in English, it's translated as uprising. And so I was just curious because they have a different sensibility, and I found that very interesting. But the whole thing is interesting, how the dead are with us and the transformation, I think, that he talked about when mass graves are discovered in the ritual of that. I find that also very rich and compelling. So this has been a fabulous conversation for me to be part of, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yes, many thanks from me to Susan and Nancy and Carlos and Juan Manuel for this great event. And my final word, I suppose, is just to endorse the spirituality of accompaniment that we see in these pages, and to say that is, I think, what theologians need to be doing, in part to address some of the concerns, Susan, that you raised about, is our scholarship serving anyone's needs but our own? And so I think that accompaniment is a way for us to stay in relationships that can shape the work we're doing and bring us to the kind of epistemic conversion and transformation, Carlos, that you are advocating. So I just want to countersign all of that and wish you all well.
And I'll countersign Andrew's countersigning. I endorse it also. But again, I think, and Carlos, we could have discussions for days on this, the temporality, spatiality issue. It's not a divide, they are a continuum in many, many ways. But for me, the idea of the resurrection introduces a focus on temporality, on Messianic time, which relativizes the literalization of space. So the nation state as this identity that, was called into being by God is ridiculous in view of cosmic time. So anyhow, again, we can have a huge discussion on this, but thank you.
Of course. And the last word I would like just to add is a great thanks to the translators. Particularly the questions are like insurrection, and uprising, so on. So Leslie Pasco and Tonya Osher, two Americans who are living in Mexico for many years, and they have been doing a great job. It took a while. It was very complicated, the translation of this book for them. But anyway, also Francis Bocusi as research assistant in Boston College, who helped me a lot trying to double check the the theological term, and so on. Thank you so much, Alios Ventos, again, and all of you, Nancy, Andrew, and Susan.
No, thank you all. I realize it's getting late, and for me, you can barely see me. I'm gonna turn into a ghost very soon. So before we finish, I just want to give you a few parish announcements. We invite you to visit the Alios Ventos Ediciones website, aliosventos.com, and to follow us on our... Oh, thank you, love. That's my wife there. God bless her. So we want to invite you to visit aliosventos.com, where, as Carlos mentioned, you can find Carlos' book for free. The point of doing that is that the most people can access these materials, and of course, you're welcome to download it for free from anywhere in the world. We believe in the cause of open access, because we believe it is a matter of social justice to give access to people to these works. You can also follow us on our social networks: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. By the way, this video is going to stay posted in YouTube and Facebook. And the resurrection as Messianic anticipation, grieving, memory, and hope from the survivor's perspective by Carlos Mendoza Álvarez is on sale both in print and digital formats worldwide, including Mexico. Like most of our books from the Library of Philosophy and Theology, you can download this title in digital form from Alios Ventos. But you can also find the publications of Alios Ventos Ediciones on Google Play Books, Book Depository, Amazon, and Kindle globally. In Mexico, you will find them in the online stores of El Sótano, Sanborns, and Gandhi, or by writing to us through our social networks. You will find the paperback and the hardcover print-on-demand versions of Alios Ventos book there. Don't miss out on our latest releases from our Library of Philosophy and Theology. Look up for Festín del Deseo by Ángel Francisco Méndez Montoya, The Spirituality of T.S. Eliot by Walter Redmond. In my opinion, the best glose that's ever been produced of T.S. Eliot's spirituality. Inmigración, Territorio, this in Spanish. Inmigración, Territorio y Fronteras, coordinated by Luis Javier López Fargeat and Cecilia Coronado. And from our collections of narrative Theseus, look up for Inmóvil Yerto Destrozado by Pablo Soler Frost, and Sabor Mortal from our collection of philosophy, published by the written by the award-winning poet and translator Mario Murgia. We also invite you to help us publish Alios Ventos' upcoming titles, amongst them Jesus, the Forgiving Victim by James Allison, translated into Spanish as La Víctima que Perdona by Ángel Méndez and Pablo Soler Frost, and Nietzsche y el Sentido Trágico del Sufrimiento by Víctor Ignacio Coronel Piña. Besides the scholarly titles non-fiction titles we're about to release in our fiction collection Fabulario by Guillermo Callejas and La Naturaleza del Amor by Miguel Abraham. Don't forget that you can also download for free or get mutual accompaniment in the Divine Ruach on Discernment and Spirituality at Uncertain Times, which is a conversation between Carlos Mendoza Álvarez and Juan Carlos Lapuente Tapia, to help us keep the feast free for anyone to grab some. You can join our funders on Patreon, patreon.com/aliosventos, or make one-off donations via our PayPal that we will very much appreciate, because books are not made for free. And well, that's that. before I thank you all and say goodbye, I just want to remind you that it is a bad charm of luck. It is quite unlucky not to buy a book whose presentation you just attended. So I'm just gonna leave it there
It's a good point.
for you to know. And well,
Yes.
thank you very much
Thank
to you
you.
all, wherever you are in the world. And thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Susan. And well, that's that. Thank you. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.